11:03 in the morning. A 16-year-old girl types out a message to her boyfriend. 3 words, nothing more. She's home. She's fine. She's listening to music. He reads it, smiles, and moves on with his day, the way you do when you think there will always be another message coming. There won't be. Minutes later, there's a knock at her bedroom door. And here is the thing you have to understand before we go any further. It isn't a stranger on the other side of that door. It's someone she has known almost her entire life. Someone who has eaten dinner at her family's table. Someone who stood in a wedding photo just 2 years earlier, smiling in a suit. Someone who was, on paper, family. He's carrying a bag. Inside it are things that no visitor should ever bring into a teenage girl's bedroom. He tells her it's just a conversation. It isn't. Within minutes, her phone goes silent forever. And in broad daylight, on a quiet residential street in Bristol, England, with neighbors going about their ordinary afternoon just a few feet away, her body is carried out of that house and placed into the trunk of a car parked in the driveway. Now here's what should stop you cold. Her stepmother comes home less than 2 hours later. She walks through that same front door, and the people responsible, they're still inside, calm, composed, acting like it's any other day. That evening, her boyfriend shows up, worried, asking where she is. They tell him she just left, and the entire time they're saying it, her body is sitting in a car parked outside, close enough to reach out and touch. Her name was Becky Watts. Everyone called her Becky. And what happened over the next 12 days would become one of the largest and most disturbing investigations in the history of British policing. A case that would expose a secret hiding in plain sight, inside her own family. This is how it happened. This is how it unraveled. And this is how the people closest to Becky Watts finally ran out of lies. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and let me know what city or country you're watching from tonight. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. And if true crime documentaries like this one are what you're here for, consider subscribing. There's a lot more coming. Now let's rewind to the ordinary Thursday morning, when nobody yet knew anything was wrong. Thursday, the 19th of February, 2015. An unremarkable morning in the St. George area of Bristol. Gray skies. The kind of forgettable, in-between winter day that nobody remembers, until they're forced to remember every single detail of it. Becky had spent the night before at a friend's house, the way 16-year-olds do. Nothing unusual, nothing that made anyone pause. She came home the next morning, and by every account, that was the last time her family saw her. When she left the house again, she took her tablet, her phone, and her laptop. That was it. No overnight bag, no change of clothes, no sign at all that she planned to be gone longer than a few hours, because she didn't. This was not a girl packing to run away. This was a girl who expected to be home by dinner. And then she simply stopped. No replies to texts, no answered calls, no trace on social media. And for anyone who knew Becky, that alone was enough to set off alarm bells. Her friends said she practically lived on her phone, always messaging someone, always reachable. One friend who'd spoken to her just the day before said she'd seemed completely normal. No stress, no arguments, nothing weighing on her, nothing that looked like a girl about to vanish. By late afternoon, the silence had stretched too long to feel like a coincidence. It started to feel like something else entirely. At 4 o'clock, a call went out to 999. Becky Watts, 16 years old, was officially reported missing. Her father, Darren, did what any terrified parent does in that first helpless hour. He turned to the internet, posting a plea on Facebook that would be shared thousands of times within days. His daughter had left that morning to meet her boyfriend and never arrived. None of her friends had seen her. The police were already searching, and he was scared in a way he'd never admit to feeling before. One of the senior officers assigned to the case, Detective Richard Owen, later said the thing that unsettled investigators most wasn't just that Becky was gone. It was the silence around her. A teenage girl who never went quiet online had suddenly gone completely dark, as if she'd vanished not just from her home, but from the internet itself. Within hours, this wasn't a local worry anymore. The story spread across news outlets, across social media, across a city that was about to spend the next 12 days holding its breath. But to understand what was about to happen to Becky Watts, you first have to understand who she was and the people who surrounded her. To understand what Bristol lost that February, you have to go back further than a missing persons report. You have to go back to the 3rd of June, 1998, the day Rebecca Watts was born. Her parents, Darren and Tanya, had already separated by the time she arrived. For a while she lived with her mother, but concerns about neglect eventually led to Becky and her older brother, Dan, being taken into the care system. One of those quiet family hardships that rarely makes headlines, but shapes a whole childhood all the same. Not long after, both children went to live with their father, Darren. And that's where Becky's world steadied. The people who knew her described someone who was, in the best possible way, a handful, strong-willed, a little fiery when she needed to be. She had a sharp sense of humor that could catch you off guard. Around the people she trusted, she was confident, loud, fully herself. But that confidence didn't always travel with her. At school, she was quieter, more reserved, almost a different version of the girl her family knew at home. One of her teachers remembered her differently still, as someone with an enormous capacity for kindness. The kind of student who noticed when someone else was struggling and actually did something about it. She didn't have a huge circle of friends. She didn't need one. The friends she had, she held onto tightly, and they held onto her the same way. That small, fierce loyalty that only really exists between teenagers who have chosen each other. Meanwhile, her family kept growing. Darren began a relationship with a woman named Angie, who brought her own son into the picture, a young man named Nathan Matthews, several years older than Becky, who'd known her since she was barely a toddler. In 2013, Darren and Angie married, and the blended family stood together to celebrate. Nathan served as a groomsman. Becky, alongside Nathan's girlfriend Shauna, stood as a bridesmaid. On paper, it was a family photograph like countless others. Two households folding into one. A wedding day meant to mark a fresh start. Less than 2 years later, that same family would be sitting in front of television cameras, pleading for information about where their 16-year-old daughter had gone. Nobody watching those vows, those toasts, that dancing, could have guessed that two of the people standing closest to the happy couple were about to become the center of a nightmare. But that's exactly where this story is headed, because the investigation into Becky's disappearance was about to lead detectives right back into her own family, and what they'd find there would be almost impossible to comprehend. 5 days, that's how long it had been since Becky vanished with nothing but a laptop and a phone, and in 5 days, investigators had almost nothing to show for it. No messages, no sightings, no trace. Officers combed the open ground near her house, the kind of search that usually turns up something, even something small. This time, nothing. By Wednesday, the 25th of February, police made a decision that told the family just how serious things had become. They asked Darren and Angie to leave their own home so a full forensic search could be carried out. Still nothing. So the search widened. 6 separate teams fanned out across Bristol, moving through wooded areas and 3 additional properties. The College of Policing and the National Crime Agency were brought in, the kind of specialized backup that isn't called for a routine runaway. A helicopter circled overhead. Officers searched Troopers Hill Nature Reserve and a nearby lake, the kinds of places where searches for missing people sometimes end in the worst way. But not this time. Online, the hashtag #FindBecky had taken on a life of its own, with police using social media to keep the public watching and engaged. Volunteers walked the streets. Posters went up on every corner, a city that refused to stop looking. but with the physical search coming up empty. Investigators shifted their focus to the people who knew Becky best. Hoping the answer wasn't buried somewhere in the woods, but sitting inside a conversation nobody had had yet. They started with her stepmother, Angie, but the two people who, according to the family's own timeline, had actually seen Becky last were her stepbrother, Nathan Matthews, and his girlfriend, Shauna Hall. And oddly, getting those two into a room wasn't simple. It took some doing before police finally sat them down at the station. Shauna did most of the talking, walking detectives through what she said had happened that day. On its own, her account sounded plausible enough, but a few things about that interview didn't sit right with the officers in the room. Shauna seemed unusually upbeat, almost bright, in a situation that called for anything but. Nathan, by contrast, barely seemed present, as if the disappearance of his own stepsister was something happening to a stranger. And then there was the detail that troubled Detective Awan most of all. Their two accounts lined up almost perfectly. In his experience, people who live through the same event separately tend to remember it differently, a few details out of sync, a couple of small contradictions. That's normal. That's human. What Nathan and Shauna gave police instead were two stories so closely matched they seemed rehearsed. But a feeling isn't evidence. And with 9 days now gone since anyone had heard from Becky, the public search only grew louder. Then investigators went back to the one place they hadn't fully torn apart, the house itself. This time, the Major Crimes Unit came with them, and forensic teams moved room by room. And in Becky's bedroom, on the door frame, they found something small, something easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. Faint traces of blood. And inside that blood, a set of fingerprints. Nathan and Shauna were brought back in for a second round of questioning, this time with investigators watching them far more closely. But even with the blood and the prints in hand, police still didn't have enough to make an arrest. Not yet. Then the lab results came back. The fingerprints in the blood on Becky's door frame belonged to Nathan Matthews. It took several more agonizing hours to identify whose blood it actually was. Investigators had already made their decision in advance. If the blood was Becky's, they would move immediately. No more waiting, no more careful questioning, an arrest on suspicion of kidnapping. The results came back. The blood was Becky's. On Saturday, the 28th of February, 2015, 9 days after a father's desperate plea had gone out to the entire country, Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hall were arrested at a house in Bristol. For a moment, it felt like the beginning of an answer. But what no one in that house yet understood was that the truth waiting behind Nathan Matthews's front door was so much darker than a kidnapping, and it was about to change the entire investigation. An arrest isn't an answer. It's a door swinging open onto more questions. And the deeper investigators looked into Nathan Matthews, the more that door seemed to lead somewhere they didn't want to go. Nathan was 10 years older than Becky, and he'd known her since she was barely 2, since the day his mother first started seeing her father. But knowing someone that long doesn't always mean closeness. His relationship with Darren had always carried an edge of tension. Nathan didn't take well to anyone stepping into his mother's life or his own. He got along fine with Becky's older brother, Dan. The two played video games, spent time together, the ordinary rhythm of stepbrothers who'd made peace with the arrangement. But with Becky, there was almost nothing. Nathan rarely spoke to her. He didn't even live under the same roof, choosing instead to stay with his grandmother nearby and drop in on his mother's household when it suited him. There were warning signs along the way, the kind that only look like warning signs in hindsight. When Nathan was 19, he once pulled up to the family home with a car full of young girls, and Darren refused to let any of them inside, sending Nathan straight back out. Years later, when Becky was a teenager battling an eating disorder, a real, frightening decline that terrified her family, Nathan waved it off entirely, insisting she was only doing it for attention. It would take Becky roughly a year to recover. And then there was Shauna. Back in 2008, when Nathan was 21, he brought a new girlfriend home and introduced her to the family as 19 years old. She was actually 15. Once Darren figured out the truth, he sent her home immediately. He had fought hard to get his children back after their time in care, and he wasn't going to let anything jeopardize that stability. Nathan and Shauna stayed together anyway. They eventually had a daughter of their own. And Darren, for reasons he could never quite put into words, never fully trusted her. None of that on its own was proof of anything, but it was the shape of a pattern, and patterns were exactly what investigators were starting to build. Back at the station, detectives used a careful strategy on Nathan. Let him talk, build his confidence, let him believe he was in control of the conversation, then pivot hard into direct, pointed questions. While that unfolded in one room, Shauna was being worked through her own account in another. Then forensic teams moved into the house, where Nathan and Shauna actually lived. What they found was chaos, clutter in every room, mess piled on mess, the kind of home that had clearly been neglected for a long time. But one room broke the pattern entirely. The bathroom was just as filthy and forgotten as everything else, except for the bathtub. It was spotless, not just clean, gleaming, scrubbed to a shine that had no business existing in a house that looked like this. Investigators noticed it immediately. Nobody said out loud what it might mean. Not yet. Outside the interrogation room, the city was grieving in the open. Flowers piled up outside the family's house. St. Ambrose Church opened a book of condolences and stayed lit late into the night so people could sit with candles. And somewhere in the middle of it all was a detail almost too cruel to comprehend. Becky had been killed on her brother Dan's 20th birthday. Investigators kept their cards close, telling Nathan and Shauna only that forensic teams had been through their home, never specifying what had been found, letting the uncertainty do its own quiet work. Then, after 2 more grueling days combing through that cluttered house, they got the piece that changed everything. 2 small receipts from a hardware store called B and Q. The purchase had been made on the very Friday Becky was reported missing. An electric circular saw, safety goggles, protective gloves, a mask. Store surveillance confirmed exactly who had bought them. Nathan Matthews. He and Shauna were arrested a second time. And this time, the word attached to their names wasn't kidnapping. It was murder. Police now had to walk back into the Watts family's living room and tell them the case had changed completely. That this was no longer a search for a missing girl, but a murder investigation. And that the 2 people under suspicion had been sitting at their own kitchen table days earlier, pretending to grieve alongside them. Darren would later describe that moment as the one where his entire world gave way beneath him. Behind closed doors, the pressure kept building. And on Tuesday, the 3rd of March, at 26 minutes past 10 at night, it finally broke. Nathan's lawyer delivered a written statement to police, and Nathan himself couldn't bear to hear it read aloud, physically covering his ears rather than listen to his own words. In it, he admitted responsibility for Becky's death. He described arriving at the house with Shauna, carrying a bag containing items meant to restrain her, going up to her bedroom under the pretense of just talking, and then a struggle, one in which his mask slipped and Becky saw his face. He said that was the moment everything spiraled beyond his control, the moment she died. But a confession wasn't the end of the horror. It was only the beginning of understanding it. Because after Becky's death, Nathan had used that bathtub, the one that gleamed while the rest of the house rotted, along with the very tools he'd bought that same day, to do something to her body that investigators would spend the next several days trying to fully piece together. Act 8: The Discovery. 12 days after Becky Watts walked out of her family's life, A private ambulance pulled away from a residential garden on a small Bristol estate. Detectives had made the discovery the night before. The outcome her family had quietly feared for nearly 2 weeks was now confirmed in the worst possible way. Her remains had been dismembered. 3 men and 2 women were arrested on suspicion of helping to conceal what had happened, in addition to Nathan and Shauna. The people living in the house where the remains were found insisted they hadn't known what was inside the bags left there. Some would later admit to assisting an offender. 2 others facing the same accusation were ultimately cleared. Detective Sergeant John Dowling led that final search, uncovering suitcases and bags in which Becky's remains had been carefully wrapped and hidden. A deliberate, methodical effort to make sure she was never found. The forensic report that followed was almost unbearable to read. Becky had fought back hard. She'd suffered extensive injuries in that struggle. The official cause of death was asphyxiation, with additional wounds inflicted afterward. Her body had changed so much that investigators could only confirm her identity through DNA testing. For the officers of Avon and Somerset Police, who had turned this into one of the largest search operations the force had ever run, who had genuinely hoped until the very end that they might bring Becky home alive, this was the ending nobody wanted to write. And yet, even with a confession in hand and a body finally found, the full truth still wasn't finished revealing itself. Because investigators weren't convinced they had the whole story, especially when it came to exactly how much Shauna Hall had really known and how far back this had all actually begun. Remember the opening of this story, the messages that stopped, the stepmother who came home to 2 people acting normal, the boyfriend turned away at the door while Becky's body sat feet away. By the time this case reached its end, investigators had reconstructed nearly every minute of that day. And once you hear it laid out in full, it becomes almost impossible to comprehend how anyone could sit through that day and say nothing. It started at 10:50 that Thursday morning, when Becky came home after her night at a friend's. Nathan and Shauna arrived not long after, stopping at a Tesco on the way to pick up batteries. A small, almost forgettable errand that would later read like something far more calculated. They knew Angie had a hospital appointment that day, which meant Becky would be home alone. And instead of parking on the street the way Nathan usually did, he backed the car into the driveway, angling the trunk toward the front door. At 11:03, Becky sent her boyfriend that final message, just listening to music, nothing more. She never replied to him again. In the minutes that followed, she was attacked and strangled. Her body was placed into the trunk of that car, parked in plain sight on an ordinary residential street. At 12:45, Angie came home. Nathan and Shauna simply carried on as though nothing had happened. At 5 o'clock, Becky's boyfriend arrived at the door, worried because she'd gone quiet. Shauna answered, made a show of checking Becky's room, and told him she wasn't there. He spoke with Darren and Angie, and together they agreed it wasn't like Becky to disappear like this. Nobody in that conversation knew she was already gone, or that her body had been sitting in a car outside for hours. At 7 that evening, after spending most of the day in the company of Becky's grieving, unknowing family, Nathan and Shauna finally left and drove home, bringing her body with them. What happened next took place in that same bathtub investigators would later find scrubbed unnaturally clean. Afterward, the 2 of them ordered pizza and Chinese food, as though the day had been like any other. The following day, Nathan invented an excuse, a friend supposedly needing help, and left to buy the items that would later be tied directly to disposing of evidence. That afternoon, at 3:10, Shauna sent him a strikingly casual text asking what time he finished work, punctuated with law. 50 minutes later, at 4 o'clock, the 999 call went out. Becky Watts was officially a missing person, and Shauna even shared Darren's Facebook appeal, asking the public to help bring his daughter home. When police came to the house that evening, Nathan and Shauna calmly told them they'd heard Becky leave that same morning, a detail that placed her disappearance safely after the moment she'd actually died. By 9 that night, the two of them were home, sitting in front of a laptop, watching a YouTube video whose title left little to the imagination about what it was for. Over the following days, they made repeated trips out to buy cleaning and concealment supplies. And in the early hours of the 24th, a CCTV camera caught a white van moving from Cotton Mill Lane toward the property where Becky's remains would later be found. Almost certainly, the vehicle used to move her body to its final hiding place. With Nathan's written confession in hand, investigators still weren't finished. They needed to know exactly how much Shauna had known and when. She maintained that she'd only learned the full truth the day before Nathan's statement was written. Police weren't convinced, and they kept digging. After 96 hours of questioning, Nathan Matthews was formally charged with the murder of his stepsister. In his own account, he tried to frame the plan as something twisted into a lesson, claiming he'd meant to frighten Becky, to make her more appreciative of life and of the people around her, particularly his mother. He talked about a suitcase, about tape, about a wooded area, about a mask he'd keep on while he scared her, and then simply walked away. It was a version of events that collapsed under the weight of everything the evidence already showed. Shauna, at that point, was charged only with perverting the course of justice. There simply wasn't enough yet to charge her with murder. But investigators didn't stop there. Over the following 8 weeks, they tore through phone records and computer data from both devices. And buried inside one of Shauna's phones, they found something that reframed the entire case. A string of deleted messages recovered from the depths of the device, in which she and Nathan had discussed abducting and confining another young girl entirely unrelated to Becky. Alongside that, investigators uncovered additional disturbing digital material, evidence that unsettled even seasoned detectives. And then, once again, it was the physical evidence that closed the gap between suspicion and certainty. Shauna's DNA was found on the bag used to conceal parts of Becky's body. It was also found on one of the masks. There was no explaining that away. On the 22nd of June, Shauna Hall was formally charged with the murder of Becky Watts. Before the legal system caught up to what had happened, the family had to say goodbye. Becky's funeral was held at St. Ambrose Church on the 17th of April, open to the public, with mourners lining the streets as her coffin passed on a horse-drawn carriage. The burial afterward was private, just close family, and as the coffin was carried out of the church, a single white dove was released into the sky above Bristol, climbing higher and higher until it disappeared from sight. The trial began on the 6th of October, 2015, at Bristol Crown Court, and even a family that had already endured the unthinkable wasn't prepared for everything that surfaced. It emerged that 2 years before her death, Becky had confided in a friend that Nathan had described, in specific detail, exactly how he planned to kill her. She never told her family. Witnesses from Nathan's time in the cadets and the Territorial Army painted a picture of a young man once known for a kind of cheeky confidence, whose temper had begun surfacing more and more over the years, moments of snapping, of throwing things when frustration took over. The prosecutor laid out for the jury a motive that went beyond simple resentment toward Becky. He argued the two defendants shared a disturbing common interest tied to the ages of the people they targeted. This wasn't only about anger or jealousy toward a stepsister. There was a second motive underneath it, one far darker than anything the public had been told. Shauna took the position that she was innocent, telling the court she'd acted out of fear of her own boyfriend. The prosecution rejected that framing entirely, arguing the two had operated as partners from the very start. One plan, one crime, carried out together. Perhaps the most striking testimony came from someone almost nobody expected to hear from: Shauna's own estranged mother, a woman she'd barely spoken to in years. The court heard that in the days right after Becky vanished, Shauna suddenly wanted to reconnect, showing up and calling out of nowhere. Her mother recalled one unsettling moment, a joke Shauna tossed off almost casually, saying she knew why she kept coming over, because she was hiding from the police after kidnapping Becky. Her mother remembered it because Shauna didn't laugh when she said it. The jury didn't need long. After just 3 hours of deliberation, they returned a unanimous verdict. Shauna Hall guilty of kidnapping and manslaughter. Nathan Matthews guilty of kidnapping and murder. Shauna Hall was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Nathan Matthews received a life sentence, with a minimum term of 33 years before parole could even be considered, a term the judge suggested might never actually arrive. As he was led out of the courtroom, Nathan kept his eyes down, unable to face the family sitting just feet away. Even the judge, delivering his final remarks, was visibly moved to tears as he addressed what the Watts family had endured. Becky's mother, Tanya, released a statement that needed no embellishment. She described a beautiful, kind, funny, loyal, feisty, creative daughter who had been murdered. Every day, she said, had become a living nightmare like the worst of all horror movies, except this one was real. This was her child. She was only 16. How, she asked, was she meant to cope with that? In June 2016, both Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hall appealed their convictions. Both appeals were rejected. The verdict stood. In the aftermath, a formal child protection review examined whether any of this could have been caught in advance. Its conclusion was difficult in its own way. There had been no clear, direct warning signs pointing to what Nathan and Shauna would eventually do. But the report noted that not enough attention had been paid to the wider environment around Becky, including the stepbrother and girlfriend who turned out to be so central to her death. It also connected some of Becky's earlier anxiety and difficult behavior directly to bullying from Matthews himself, a thread that had existed for years, unnoticed for what it truly was. Darren later wrote a book about his daughter. In one interview, he admitted he wished he personally had the power to ensure Nathan faced the harshest consequence possible. The grief took a visible toll, a dramatic weight loss, broken sleep, a face that friends said became almost unrecognizable in the months that followed. And yet, through all of it, Darren and Angie didn't fall apart from each other. They stayed together, carrying that grief side by side rather than letting it pull them in opposite directions. Darren said that if this didn't break them, then nothing ever would. The city carried some of that weight too. A balloon launch was held in Becky's memory. A march brought the center of Bristol to a standstill. Football stadiums fell silent for a minute in her honor. And in a local park, a small apple tree was planted for her, a quiet, living symbol of growth in the very place where so much had been lost. Those who loved Becky always came back to the same words to describe her, like a tornado, like a hurricane, and in the same breath, like a ray of sunshine. She had a way of walking into a room and making the people around her feel like they truly mattered. That's the girl this case was always about. Not the crime that ended her life, but the 16 years she spent living it, fully, fiercely, and on her own terms. Becky Watts should have had decades more ahead of her. Instead, her story became one a nation still returns to. A reminder of how much can hide behind the closed doors of an ordinary-looking home, and a reminder of how the people we're taught to trust the most are sometimes the very ones we should have been watching all along. If this story stayed with you, take a moment before you go, say her name once, remember her not for how she died, but for how brightly she lived. Rebecca Watts, Becky, 16 years old, gone far too soon but never forgotten.